Okay, we're going to start this section of chapter 3, continuing on in chapter 3, continuing on in our discussion of nonverbal interactional capacities and nonverbal code specifically this time around. We're also going to break into two of the theories that kind of surround nonverbal communication. So let's talk first about nonverbal functions. Nonverbals function for a few other reasons outside of the fact that they can be more emotionally expressive and that we can share nonverbals with people of other cultures and have them be perceived, especially based on our emotional states. But they also function to express meaning in a lot of ways, meaning involving who we like, how much we like them, other meanings including status, power, and authority, even something as simple as roles within our environment and who sort of holds what role, and emotional responsiveness, awareness to someone, and other kinds of emotions. Now, we covered a little bit of emotions when we talked about the leakage cues that people are sending out, and we talked a little bit about how those nonverbals that we're using, the smiles and the eye contact and everything, is more nonverbally emotionally receptive, right? That we perceive nonverbal more so than we do verbal, right? So if you're got your arms crossed and your husband comes home, or your boyfriend comes home, or your roommate comes home, or whoever comes home, and they ask you how your day was, and you're like, they can perceive that from you more so than just the words coming out of your mouth. So when we're looking at expressing meaning, if you take a look here at this first picture here, I'm showing you an image of two people expressing liking for one another. And they're expressing liking through that physical proximity that we explored in the first parts of chapter 3. You can see between the two of them that they're not only close together and that they're smiling, but that there's also physical touch being engaged between the two of them. All of those things clustered together show us that these two people have a relationship, and that relationship is something that both of them want and that both of them in this case like. If the woman in the, let's say, orange skirt didn't like the person in the blue shirt touching her, she would have backed away, probably put her hands out, turned her body around, face to face the threat, and said, don't touch me, right? We would do the shoulder shrugs if someone put their arm around us, right? If somebody grabbed you around the waist and you didn't like that, in most cases you would jump away and push away. It also shows a little bit of status. So if I think about how the things that I do can demonstrate to someone my power, if I'm in an argument with somebody and I stand up, I might be taking more positional power from them. If they're sitting down and I stand up and I puff out my chest and I pull back my arms, and I puff out my shoulders and I get really big, I take up more space. When we're in job interviews, we want to think about how we're using our nonverbal behavior in a way to express how confident we are in ourselves, but we don't want to over-express that level of confidence because then that can exude sort of cockiness and be perceived as the person who's interviewing you as a phrase threat. So let me show you a few things to begin with, and you'll see this paralleled in some of the videos that I've showed you. So when typically people interview, they interview something similar to this, right? You're the interviewer and I'm the interviewee, and I come into the room and the chair is square up against the desk. So I sit in the desk. Now, if I'm a man, typically men will display their hands out on a table. They tend to take up more space. So in your observations of your face-to-face classes, look around the room and see what some of the gender differences are in the nonverbal behavior of others. So men tend to take up space, right? They tend to kind of sit, they tend to take up more space with their arms and their elbows. Whereas women tend to cross their legs, sit with their hands in their lap, curl their backs and their shoulders a little bit more and take up a little bit less space. So if I'm in a job interview and I'm kind of sitting like this and you ask me if I can do the job and I say, yeah, I feel completely confident that I can do the position. That says one thing to the audience, but it also means another to your audience because of the way your body is positioned. Now, if I were to take that same chair and I were to push it out, turn it a little bit to the side, it still allows me the opportunity to close my legs and cross my legs because I'm trying to be ladylike. But it gives me more opportunity to kind of expand the area in which I'm taking up the space, but to do it in a way, like I said, that's still conservative. If I put my arm on this chair, I can still have the opportunity to cover a little bit, right? I can kind of protect the things that are important to me. I can still keep one hand down and one hand in my lap. But what it does is it brings my shoulders back a little bit, it brings my head up a little bit, I take up more space, and I just appear off the surface a bit more confident. So now if you were to ask me, can you do the job? And I say, yeah, I absolutely feel like I can do this job. I not only look more confident, but what it does is it also changes the way that I behave in other ways. My tone of voice, maybe perhaps my eye contact, my ability to gesture grows. So the differences are kind of easy to see when I go back to this view. So in terms of status, we can show that through the nonverbal behaviors that we have when we're communicating with others. Other things that we might do is we might steeple. Other nonverbals might be gestures like this, which are to downplay the other person, to take power over the other person, sort of push them down, if you will, with your gesturing. If we could do this, so that's like, give me, open palms. What do you want? What do you need? What can I do for you? Which is a little different than what do you want? What do you need? What can I do for you? Thinking about some of those things that we do and how those things are expressing to other people power, authority, status seeking, confidence. And then our responsiveness and awareness to others. If someone says, hey, and you turn to them and you actually look at them and you say, yeah, what's up? You're turning and you're making eye contact and you're pivoting your shoulders. You're showing them that you see them. You're showing them that you hear them and that you're aware that they're there. That is a nonverbal indicator of awareness. It's a nonverbal indicator that you're being responsive to them. If someone says, hey, and you go, oh yeah, what's up? It shows them that you're not really paying attention, that you're not really aware or responding to them. And of course, the emotional expression of meaning. Another thing that nonverbal can do is to regulate the flow of interaction. We can do a lot of things with the nonverbals. If you raise your hand in class and I point to you and I say, yeah, you over there in the corner, I'm going to be giving you the nonverbal cue that it's your turn, that you can go ahead and take your turn. I might say something like, yeah, go ahead, you first, right? You first. This just happened to me in the elevator door opened and there was a gentleman sitting next to me and he just kind of gestured like this and I went, oh, thank you. And I walked in the elevator. That was his gesture to say, go ahead into the elevator. It's your turn first. If somebody was in your office or in your space and you didn't want them there, you may actually get up from your chair, go over to the door and open the door and then say, I've got a class in half an hour if you don't mind. That is going to be a nonverbal that's going to parallel the words coming out of your mouth, right? You're saying you have to leave. You're showing them the door. You're literally like, get out of the way. Other things like leave taking cues, hello and goodbye. Other professional context cues that come from nonverbal codes. We also want to think about the way in which we use space and territory, because space and territory is also a nonverbal. Think about the way in which your professors have their offices set up. Now, some professors, when you walk into their office, they have maybe their desk over in the corner. My office at least has a desk in the corner and then a coffee table and a couch. I'm using my space and my territory as a more informal setting to show you that the relationship building that's going on in my office is perhaps more important to me than maybe the academic or this task side or the business side, if you will, of my office. But if you were to come into my office and the first thing you do is you encounter a desk and the professor's sitting on one side and you're sitting on the other side, it shows you that the heart of what is going on in that office is task, is academic, is sort of school related, is business related. It also shows you a clear sort of status. You're over there, I'm over here, I'm on this side of the desk, you're on that side of the desk. This is where you and I belong because I'm your professor and you're the student. Think about when you go into doctor's offices, right? And the doctor says, come, you have to sit up on this table so that I can kind of check you out. They're showing you your particular place to be, but you're on an exam table. And so again, that's a professional context cue that says that you're going to be given in an examination, and this is the place in which you do it. Regulating and monitoring flow and conversation and interaction happens as well. If you think about airlines, as they're directing people or cops directing traffic, we do a lot of things with a nonverbal. I think if you really started to think about all the things that go into a nonverbal situation, it kind of would rock your socks in terms of how much nonverbal is actually going on. The way people sit around a table, the way people sit next to one another, where our lockers are in the locker room, where we park our cars, even the places in which you use your urinals. Food for thought, right? Because if you came into a bathroom and there were 4 urinals and there was a guy at this urinal, most of you would say that you wouldn't go to urinal 2 or urinal 4, that you would go to urinal 1. Because that is a space, proximity, nonverbal indicator that you're going to give that person their personal space. If there were 2 people already, right, at urinal 1 and urinal 3, some people have actually suggested they would use the stall, or they would wait, or that they would go to the end so that they would at least only encounter the personal space of one individual instead of encountering the personal space of two individuals. Just something to think about. I love thinking about it too when I go to the movies as well, where people are sitting, how people are sitting. Nonverbals also function in a few other ways when we talk about modifying verbal meaning. That has already come up in the previous slide when I said, in addition to showing them the door, I don't just say, I don't just open the door and point at it and do that. I literally accompany my gestures with words. I've got a class in half an hour, if you don't mind. Showing you the door, but I'm also paralleling what I'm showing you with my voice. So in terms of verbal meaning, we've got things like complimenting. So I might elaborate, right? If I say there are 4 urinal spots, I might show you that there are 4. I can also accent, which is what I just did too when I said, right, there's a guy at urinal 3. Where would you go? You would probably go to urinal 1. I'm using my nonverbals not only to elaborate what I'm saying, but to get you to focus on specific things. There are 3 main points I want you to remember. We do things like repeating. So anytime you see someone kind of doing this, they're repeating it, right? So today I want to talk about, right, they're repeating thoughts that are going on in their head and kind of gesturally moving forward with their day. Of course, substituting, which is what we've got here with this little boy. For sometimes when words won't do, right? When the person in front of you cuts you off, you throw your hands in the air and you literally say, "What are you thinking?" They can't hear you, but they can see you gesturing, "What are you thinking?" Or in this boy's case, gesturing something a bit more profane, because of course when you want to tell somebody to F off and you want to, but you can't tell them because you're stuck inside of a vehicle or you're, I don't care, stuck on top of a roller coaster ride or whatever, you can gesture to them that. But sometimes these gestures can get to be mixed messaged, especially if perhaps I'm throwing the finger at a friend, because that might be an inside joke rather than substituting for a nasty word, right? But again, that's still substitution because I'm substituting for an inside joke. Sometimes we have things that contradict that happen. I feel like this is like rub your tummy and pat your head, right? And that's kind of really hard for most of us to do because there's a brain channel contradiction that's happening here. I think it's happened to me a few times where I've been like, there are 3 things I want you to know, and I put up 2 instead of 3. That's just a contradiction that happens. Sometimes it happens because your brain is thinking, and as your brain is thinking, you're also trying to send those brain signals to your body to do something, and then at the last minute you change your mind and everything just kind of hasn't caught up. Some of this is brain function. Some of this is actually learned behavior. So one thing that's really interesting with learned behavior is I want you all to think about the way in which you count. So count from 1 to 5 right now. 1 on your fingers. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. How many of you started to count by going like this? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. How many of you counted like this? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We learn different things for different reasons. One of the reasons that I was kind of told we didn't in at least Eastern European, we didn't teach children how to count like this was because this sort of symbolizes FU. This is the peace sign, this means FU, and so really culturally, depending on where you're at, you wouldn't want to count like this because you could be sending the message of FU to somebody that you didn't want to send the message to. So children were taught to count with the thumb like this because you're not sending a mixed message to anybody. But of course, in American culture, we don't see there being a distinct difference between this gesture and this gesture, so we just count 1, 2. Thinking about that's just kind of a fun, interesting thing to think about. I might suggest that you trace that back if you count with your thumb and your finger to perhaps where the descendants of your family were and how that was sort of passed on to you, or whether it's just kind of something that everybody else around you did and so you learned that way, how you were taught, modeling, where your teacher comes from, all those things that can affect the kinds of gestures that we use and the things that we do with our body. We talked a little bit on the first slide about artifacts, right? And one of the artifacts that I referenced was a wedding ring and how wedding rings are sort of different for everybody. And like if you didn't wear a wedding ring, but instead you had a nice tan line, for some people that might suggest that you're recently split up or recently divorced. In my husband's case, he broke his. So he does not wear a ring, but he has a clear tan line from where his ring was. It has come up in social conversations, actually. He did have somebody approach him once at a bar and say, "Are you guys doing okay?" Brian was like, "Why?" And he's like, "Because I noticed you're not wearing your ring." And he's like, "Oh yeah, I broke it." So an interesting conversation that stemmed from artifacts. So I just kind of put this up here as just a fun little test to get us thinking about how artifacts are and what significance artifacts have in our lives. the first thing that I might ask people is to, let's see if I can go back here, to describe this man. Tell me a little bit about what he does for a living. Tell me a little bit about, where he works. So, what he does and then where he works. Does he work in a rural community? Does he work in a city? Does he do, business, or is he a teacher? Like, what kind of career field is he in and where does he live? How, in terms of the hierarchy of where he's working, how high up on the food chain is he? Is he sort of at the level of an intern? Do you think that he is just a regular employee? Is he a manager, a supervisor, a CEO? What is he? And based on those answers, one of the things that you've given, one of the things that I would start to ask you is why? What is it about him that suggests that? And when we kind of come back to in some of these conversations is his suit, right? The way he's dressed. It's tailored nicely. It fits him perfectly. It clearly did not come from Kohl's. It is pressed and it looks like it's steamed. So it's clearly not something he wears every single day. It's not that one suit that he owns that he wears for every speech he has to give in university education. He is really well tailored. His hair is really well cut, right? He's clean shaven. He's also young. So we may assume that he is important where he works, right? But we might not assume that he is too far up the hierarchy of perhaps the organizational chain because of his age. We may assume that he has finer tastes because he's dressed nice. Some people would suggest that he works more like a Wall Street or a banking job and that he probably works in a city instead of a country town. Part of that has to do with the way he looks. So his suit, his tie, his haircut, all those things represent for us artifacts that in a way help us categorize what people do, who people are, and our expectations for how people behave. It is the foundation of a stereotype. And I'm not suggesting that stereotypes are correct. They certainly are not a correct way to communicate with others. But they are the first thing. They are the first things that we kind of go to when we meet someone, when we see somebody. We size them up for what they look like and what artifacts they are. And we say, like, can I date this person? Oh, they have a wedding ring, so no, I can't date them. Do I have similarities with this person in common? And you're like, geez, they're dressed so nicely and they're so clean shaven and I barely got my life together today. Then probably we don't have too many things in common, right? Or you look at their age and you're like, they're so young and I'm so old. No, we probably shouldn't date. So you think about some of those things, and some of those things that you're thinking about probably stem from artifacts. So the next question that I have is, would this guy drive this car, right? Or is this car perhaps too much for this guy? Is this a masculine car? Is this a feminine car? If he's not the driver of this car, then who is? Now, more often than not, in actual discussions, face-to-face classroom, I get that he would not drive this car, that this car is probably driven by a woman. So my next question to folks is usually, okay, how old is that woman? Usually classes would respond to, that woman is probably in her 40s, maybe 50s, okay? And what color dress is she wearing? Now, I made the assumption she'd be wearing a dress. Maybe she'd be wearing pants. Most people would probably say she wears a dress. There's my, biases coming out with regards to artifact awareness demonstrated perfectly for you. But most students would say that her dress is red, which is interesting because, of course, this is a powerful car. So she must be a powerful person, or at least wearing red. So that leads me to the third one. Take a look at this artifact significance. Would the woman in the red dress driving this car wear this ring? Most people in the face-to-face classrooms in which I've done this have said yes, this would be the woman who's driving that car. Could she date this man? Now, most people have said no, she probably wouldn't date this man unless it's sort of a 50 Shades of Grey thing, and she's looking for sort of a younger, more energetic guy. What we probably haven't noticed, though, about this photograph is that this is a ring on the right hand. So this isn't her wedding ring. This is something that's for show. This is something that's maybe worn during a fancy event. So one thing that kind of comes up is sometimes with artifacts like this, we can rent fancy jewelry. So maybe she doesn't actually own this. Maybe she's rented. Maybe it's fake. What does it say about her if that's a fake ring? What does it say about her if that's a real ring? So we're really reading into the significance of artifacts, but artifacts do hold a particularly powerful place in how we understand one another, how we understand relationships, how we even understand culture. You can look at some of the things that have come out in the National Geographic about how they have interpreted artifacts of pottery, of grave markers, of even the way that bodies have been displayed. And we can look at that and we can say, okay, well, this culture clearly valued wheat. And this culture buried all of their children in one particular area. So that tells us that they either really highly valued children or they didn't value children. Oh, look, they, built their houses all sort of facing the sunrise. So clearly the sunrise was very important to them. Artifacts like Stonehenge have become something that we really look at in terms of trying to understand how people communicated, how they lived, what they valued, and what their culture was like. Artifacts. So here's a few other questions for you to think about in terms of grounding this into something that's more familiar for you. If you are on a college campus or you're on NMU's campus, think about what are some of the status symbols that are represented on your campus, on our campus. If you're somewhere else, just think about your community. What are some of the sort of status symbols found in your community? What possessions, what dress would create negative impressions for you? What possessions or dress would create positive impressions for you? And how does even age take a role in artifact importance? Thinking about some of these things might kind of give rise to some sort of self-introspection or maybe some thoughts to the way in which those artifacts are affecting your communication with others in your environment. Okay, so let's move on. So in terms of thinking about nonverbal, I referenced at the beginning of this PowerPoint slide that we were going to talk about two specific theories that relate to how we understand some of our nonverbal behavior. So expectancy violation theory is the first one, and it probably is my favorite theory of all of the interpersonal theories, and I'll probably say that a lot because there are certainly a few that are favorites. It's like picking your favorite song. It's really hard to pick just one. But in this case, I really love expectancy violation theory. I love it for a few reasons. One, because it actually explains for me some of the crazy things that people do and the reactions that I have to those crazy things people do. And it kind of motivates me to be a little crazy sometimes just so that I can see the reactions to people when I'm the one being crazy. Let me explain this to you. Expectancy violation theory is what happens when we expect certain behavior from people and their behavior that they actually do deviates from those expectations. So when I go to kiss someone at the end of a date and they're like, what? That is an expectancy violation. They did not expect me to lean in for a kiss, but I did, and I got this response in return. Expectancy violation is predicated on a few interesting characteristics. For starters, we want to think about, if we go down to the bottom of this PowerPoint slide, we want to think about the violation valence. And so when we think about the violation valence, really what this means is how positive or how negative is this perceived something. So think about a hug, right? A hug. Just think about a hug. Is a hug positive or is a hug negative? Now, most of us would say, well, hugs are probably positive, right? But if you got a hug from a stranger at 2 a.m. in a dark alley, you might not feel that that is very positive. You'd probably feel that that's negative. So it's what the perceived violation is in terms of the valence on a scale of whether it's positive or negative, and even maybe whether it's neutral or neutral towards negative or neutral towards positive. The other thing that happens with expectancy violation that we need to consider is the reward value in the other person. Is there a reward value in the relational dynamics that I have with this other person? Because if I know this person and I want to get to know this person and I like this person and I see a potential future with this person, then their behavior towards me might not be as strong of a violation, as strong of a negative for me, because I see them as someone I want to maintain a relationship with, where I want to continue to have a relationship with. If I look at this person and I'm like, 0 rewards, I don't want a relationship with you, who the heck are you? Then their behavior might be perceived as more negative, or the violation might be perceived as more negative because I expect that they'll kind of keep their distance from me, and I want to keep my distance from them because there's no reward value in it for me. So there are two things that kind of happen when we experience expectancy violation theory. And I'm going to give you lots of examples here in a second. This will all make sense. We can compensate, we can push away. So the example I gave you was of the two girls. When the two girls were hugging, one was kind of touching the other around the waist. She was leaning into her and she was smiling, right? If we didn't like the touching that someone was engaging in with us, in this case she was like kind of grappling her around the waist, we would put distance between ourselves and the person who's touching us. We wouldn't lean in. Instead, we would compensate. We would reduce that. We would turn our body and we would go, what? Don't touch me. No, thank you. Right? If someone puts their arm around us and we don't want their arm, we would compensate. We would reduce by basically like getting space between ourselves and that person's arm. The other thing that can happen is that we reciprocate. So if you go in for a kiss and the person's kind of like, okay, and they kiss you back, they're reciprocating. They're showing you that that behavior is more positive and not negative. They're also showing you that there's a reward value because they're reciprocating. They're sort of reusing the behavior and they're marrying the two together. And that shows you that they want that. If they push away, it's showing that they don't see a reward value for you and that the behavior is perceived as negative. So take these 3 examples down here that I've got for you. This first one we have here is the 2 individuals in a grappling hug, right? And if you look at just the feeling that's being expressed by this photo, it's really quite beautiful. What we see there is we see a relationship that is mutually inclusive, that's reciprocal. These 2 individuals clearly have a deep affection for one another. There's no expectancy violation happening here. Seth hugged Jake, and Jake hugged Seth back, and thus turned into this 30-second hug between these 2 men. They have really missed one another. They see each other like brothers. They really, really love one another. And so because of that, they're going to reciprocate the behavior. There's a high level of reward towards one another. The behavior is seen as positive. There's no violation here. No one's getting hugged and being like, well, that's kind of a weird hug. Oh, that's uncomfortable. Right? There's nothing happening there. It's not really an expectancy violation. In this case, we might say it is expected because this is Seth's wedding and Jake has come a very long way to be at Seth's wedding and they haven't seen each other in years. So one would kind of assume that, you should cue the slow music and watch the 2 of them run at each other very slowly across the field to hug rather than have any kind of violation occur. If we look at this picture up here, we can see a few interesting things. This is me with a friend of mine, Matt, at his wedding. Now, Matt is the groom and he's getting married. Matt happens to be the younger brother of my best friend, Tony. So Tony is as close to a brother for me as anyone besides, well, I'm not even close to my brother. So Tony is closer to me than my own brother. If something were to happen to me and Brian, Tony would be taking care of our children. He'd be the caretaker for our children. That tells you a little bit about our closeness. So this is his brother, his little brother Matt's wedding. And we were obviously invited to Matt's wedding because we're close with the whole family, but I am not close with Matt. I wouldn't say cue the slow music and have us like running and hugging towards one another. I would say that Matt and I are on more of an associated status of our relationship. We're not friends. I wouldn't even call us friends. We're 2 people who know each other through someone else, through a mutual connection, but I wouldn't say we're friends. So this is during the dollar dances. If you've ever been to a wedding, you've probably engaged in some dollar dances where you can put $1 in the hat or the bag or whatever to dance with the groom. And this is kind of a way in which the bride and groom can generate a little bit of extra money for maybe their honeymoon or, I don't know, to pay for their DJ or get a DD home, whatever it is. So I am dancing with Matt. And in dancing with Matt, my expectation going into this is that our reward level for one another is neither high nor low. It's maybe somewhat in the middle, right? I want to maintain the relationship with them, with him, because he's my best friend's little brother and I'll know him the rest of my life. But I wouldn't say that we're friends and we're particularly close. So we're kind of like neutral with one another. I would assume that we wouldn't get all like weird and touchy-feely with one another because this is his wedding and he's getting married and I'm already married and we don't have a relationship. So I would suggest that the expectation I had going into this moment was that it was going to be like sort of 2 people at an 8th grade dance, right? As my mother would say, we're leaving space for God between the 2 of us, right? You're going to kind of do one of these where I put my hands on your shoulders and you kind of put your hands in like a neutral spot on my back and we dance and that's about it. Well, that's not exactly what happened. Matt decided to be a little funny and poke around with some of the space and proximity between the 2 of us. And he pulled me really tightly in up against him, and then he dipped me to the ground. When he dipped me to the ground, we had one of those moments where our faces were like as close as they could possibly be. And then he like, right at the last minute, he like pulled me up. And this is the moment right after. So you can see a few things. I am not reciprocating in that I didn't jump on him and give him a hug and be like, that's so silly, that's so funny, oh my God, Matt, I love you. But I didn't like run away from him and be like, whoa, what the is happening right now? Okay. What I did though was balance between compensating and reciprocating. I opened my body to create more space between the two bodies, and I leaned away. So you see my head is kind of leaned away from him. My entire upper body is leaned away from him, and I'm creating more distance between him and myself, and he's actually doing the same. So you can see from that the violation is not negative. And the violation is not positive in the sense that it's not really a violation. It's somewhere kind of in between. And so we're trying to strike a balance between who we are to one another and the behavior that's just now been violated and what we want to do, whether we want to get closer or farther apart. And I didn't want to get too far apart because he is my best friend's brother. So I didn't want to run away. So I just kind of stayed there, but kind of left my body open, which is striking the balance between the two. If we look at this bottom picture here, we see a range of behaviors. This is my friend Jake, his son Liam, Berkeley, and Benjamin, when they were all pretty little, having an experience that is pretty typical of like American kids. Like there's a toad down here in the water, and the kids were all investigating the toad, and the toad jumped, right? Right as they're like down looking at the toad jumped. So what you see here is clearly a violation of expected behavior. The kids did not expect that toad to jump in their face. When that happened, we see a few things. This one right here is my son, right? He is not only compensating and reducing, he's in the process of jumping and taking a giant step back, but he's also clutching his arms to his chest. So he's literally protecting himself with his nonverbals, and he's getting as far away from that perceived threat as possible. So he's compensating. Why is he compensating? Because in this case, the behavior is seen as negative, right? It's very scary. This is the first time this has happened. He doesn't really know what's going on. And he hasn't quite figured out that frogs and toads can be really cool and kind of fun to play with. He has not figured out that he can kind of pick them up and squish them around and let them leap around and throw them and do all the horrible things that little kids do to toads and frogs. Has not figured that part out yet, so he's still learning that. He doesn't know that there's a reward value. So 0 reward value, behavior is negative, get away from me. Berkeley, however, is not quite compensating in the sense that my son is. She's kind of balancing between the two. She's still pulled away a little bit, so she's still not sure if this frog has any reward value. She's still not sure if that behavior is positive or negative, so probably like me with Matt, somewhere squarely in the middle. The two over here, no expectancy violation. These are the ones that were like, oh, look, there's a frog, and they took the kids over to the water hole in the first place to see the frog. Clearly, they've encountered frogs before. Clearly, this is a thing that they do, and so they're in. They're like super curious. They're like, wow, the frog jumped. Wow, look, it's so cool. And they're totally engaged. So reward value is high, valence is positive, so they're reciprocating. And in some cases, we would say probably not a violation of anything they expect to happen. The last story I guess I'll share with you in expectancy violation is a personal story, but it helps you understand a little bit about the different dynamics between the reward value, the violation, and then compensating and reducing. The first time that I met my husband's parents, we pull in the driveway and he says to me, there's a few things you need to know. My dad is kind of a touchy-feely, huggy kind of guy, and my mom is pretty standoffish. I've also only really ever brought one girl home, so I'm not really sure how my mom's going to respond to that. But my dad will probably be pretty positive and pretty open. I'm like, okay, great, this is going to go well. So I had the expectation that his dad was probably going to greet me, that he was probably going to be warm and kind, and that his mom, she might be a little standoffish, maybe a little judgy, right? Because she hasn't really encountered too many other girlfriends before. And this is the first time that she's meeting me, and she's obviously very protective of her son. And it was clear that they have like a really strong relationship. So I had those expectations going in. When I got to the top of the stairs, instead of his dad reaching his hand out and saying, hi, Sarah, it's nice to meet you, and for me to say, hi, Mr. Potter, it's really nice to meet you, he grabbed me in a hug, very similar to this, literally grappled me. And I'll add that my father-in-law is kind of a larger man. He's very tall. He's very broad-shouldered. He's very large. I mean, he could have been a linebacker. And he just like grapples me. I didn't even get a chance to put my arms out. So he grapples me. I'm kind of like this, and he like picks me up. I swear I was off the floor. And he like shakes me from side to side. And he's like, it's really great to meet you. And then sets me down. When he sat me down, I think I probably stood like this for a while, and then I look over at Brian as my like check-in, like, what do I do? And he's like, it's okay. I had no idea what to do, because what was going through my head at the time was, what? Like, that's so uncomfortable, but I love this boy and you're his dad, so I have to like you and you have to like me. Oh God, please like me, right? Because what would be the consequences of the significant other's parents not liking you? Pretty high consequences. So the reward value was really necessary. The reward value was really high. There are a lot of rewards that can come from my father-in-law seeing me as a potential daughter, of seeing me as someone he was comfortable with being in his house all the time, because I loved this boy and I needed his family to like me. But I was totally caught off guard, but like a grappling hug being lifted on the ground. But then when I thought about it, the hug wasn't negative, it was actually positive, right? That's a really good sign that he was open, he was receptive, he was being kind, he was being caring. It just was a little bit too forceful for me. And I wasn't really expecting that on a first encounter, because I don't really think that that's how first encounters go. Typically, there's like a handshake, and then you get to the hugging stage as you get to know one another, maybe after dinner at least. So I didn't reciprocate. I didn't kind of hug him back, and I didn't run away or hide behind Brian. I just kind of stood there and didn't really know what to do. The reward value is high. The behavior is neither positive nor negative, and so I just kind of struck a balance. So that's just another story to help us understand expectancy violation theory. So let's add a layer to expectancy violation theory, because outside of expectancy violation theory, there's probably other things you're thinking about when it comes to this stuff. I'm sure you have other questions. You're thinking like, but there's probably context. There's probably like an attitude. There's how I feel about it. There's all these things coming into play, and you'd be right. That is what's called, if I get my next slide to pop up, cognitive valence theory. Okay, I want to pick off where we left off, talking about expectancy violation theory and adding on some of the layers for cognitive valence theory so that we can kind of see how the two are interrelated. So when we're thinking about cognitive valence theory, we're thinking about all of those sort of questions that we might have about our frame of reference, our perception, how we're feeling, how the other person is feeling, and some of those sort of cognitive elements that go into thinking about what we expect out of others and their behavior and what they expect out of us in our behavior. And so some of those questions that we have emerging about expectancy violation theory help to explain a little bit about cognitive valence theory. So in just a nutshell here, cognitive valence theory adds perception, physiological arousal, which I'll explain, cognitive schema, and the nature of sort of reciprocal or the compensatory, the pushing away responses that we get. It's just, kind of adding to one theoretical perspective some other elements that need to be considered when we kind of put the two things together and look very critically at behavior between individuals. So one of the things that comes up within cognitive valence theory is this idea of increased immediacy. So one of the things that I'll kind of give you is a very brief description of immediacy is a perceived closeness with someone. So one of the things that often happens in relationships is that we use our communication to attempt to become closer to one another. Some things that maybe instructors might do in a classroom to be immediate. They might, respond to emails in a more timely manner. They might use more sort of casual or friendly communication. They might have personal conversations with students after class. They might make an attempt to get to know them. They might use jokes, humor. They might even swear in class. They may dress casually, right? There are a lot of attempts that a professor might engage in order to build a connection and a closeness with the students in their classrooms. We do the same thing. If you're a roommate and you want to build immediacy with another person on your floor, you may pop by their room, knock on the door, and introduce yourself, or you may pop by their room, knock on the door, and say, hey, I see that really cool poster on your wall. That's really a fascinating movie. Did you like it? What did you like about it? You're going to make these connections in your attempt to get closer to someone. So when we're thinking about behavior, we have to acknowledge the fact that there are behaviors that we engage in, that we do intentionally to bring people closer to one another, and behaviors that we might do if we don't want that closeness. Other things that factor into cognitive valence theory is your physiological arousal. Now, when I'm talking about physiological arousal, I'm not talking about sexual arousal. Okay, that's a totally different thing, and we're going to kind of put that over here and not really think about it. Physiological arousal has a lot to do with similar sort of chemical and body processes, but it has more a lot to do with the gut feeling that sometimes we get when something doesn't feel right or when something feels really right. And I think probably everybody has experienced this at some point or another, right? You get an email. A good example of this is I got an email from the Office of Academic and Computing Information Concerns, and it was an email about copyright infringement. And, it had my name at the top of it, and it had only my email address in the, the to browser, and I read it, and it was really just about like what copyright is and what happens when a student violates copyright and, the effects to student policy. And like at the end, it had my name and it said, again, thank you, Sarah, if we have concerns, our office will be contacting you, and then a person's name. And I immediately had that like feeling, like my heart kind of started to pump, my blood pressure went up, my stomach kind of started to swirl, and I had that like, oh my God, what did I do? Like I'm going through all the things in my head. Like, did I download something? Okay, I did download something. Was it a file that I accidentally, printed that I wasn't supposed to print? And I'm like thinking, oh my gosh, everything's for educational purposes. The author died more than 50 years ago. Like all this should be fair use. And I literally kind of spiraled into this, I don't think I can sleep thing, because I had that sort of gut feeling that this was really, really bad. Made a phone call, and what I learned from that phone call is that it is an automated email that is blanketed out to the entire campus, and they blind carbon copy people on it so that you can't see who it's all been sent to, but it really is just an informational email only, and it is a system that puts your name into it. So it's an automated generated system. So I totally misread into that. But I think we have these things where someone like walks up behind us really, really fast, and you turn and you're kind of like, whoa. Because you had that feeling inside of you that what was happening was scary or what was happening was unsettling, and there was some uncertainty with it, and it caused that sort of arousal level within your gut, right? Within this like perception of the event. And so when we're talking about moderate arousal, we're talking about something that is sort of perceived as inherently positive. Sometimes you pull in your driveway and you see a bunch of your friends' cars down the road, and you're thinking to yourself, it's my birthday, all my friends' cars are here, maybe I'm getting a surprise party, right? So you have that kind of feeling, but that feeling is not bad. That feeling is anticipatory, but it's anticipatory in a way that feels scary but positive. There's no arousal. There are things that we do every single day. So, you walk to campus every day, and probably as you walk to and from getting coffee, there's really nothing that kind of happens. In fact, most of us go on autopilot, and we get to certain places and we think to ourselves when we get there, like, gee whiz, I just got here and did I drive through this stoplight? Did I stop at that stop sign? We operate our days basically under a routine, and that routine doesn't really cause any kind of gut reaction or any kind of arousal within our physiological self. It just kind of is what it is. And then there's these like high levels of arousal. There are those times where like you kick up something in your body that tells you like, oh, something bad's going to happen, right? If you have ever watched a horror film, you've probably had this happen to you where you're sitting there and the music is going and the character's going to walk into the dark room and you're like gripping the person next to you because you're like, something like really, really bad is going to happen. I can't watch, right? And so I like to do this thing where I cover my ears because I feel like if I can't hear the music, then it doesn't feel as scary, right? That sort of psychological torment that happens with scary music. So if I cover my ears, then I can watch it without being scared. Or if I cover my eyes but I can hear what's going on, it somehow feels less scary. That's sort of high arousal, that gripping feeling where you like know something bad's going to happen and you're just really not sure what to do about it. Oh God. That is a negative feeling, right? And for most of us, we might like have trouble breathing. We might feel like we're going to throw up. Our stomach might swirl, all of those things. That's negative arousal that typically is a very heightened state of awareness. When we think about our responses to violations of expected behavior, our responses to some degree are predicated on that level of physiological awareness, right? That level of maybe the environment, if it's dark, if I'm walking alone, if I'm already feeling, uncertain, or I'm already feeling sort of unprotected and unsecured, I've already created a physiological arousal within myself that anybody's footsteps walking up behind me super fast would probably intensify those feelings. So when we're thinking about cognitive valence theory, we're going to add to this a level of our perception, our sort of frame of reference for the events that are occurring around us. And again, a lot of this is very subjective, right? Because this is how I feel. This is my awareness. This is my heightened level of uncertainty with the event. And so some of this is going to be different from one person to the next. What I might see as a highly aroused, negative, potentially negative experience, you might kind of go, happens to me all the time. When I was in Europe, one of the train stations I had to get off to in order to get back to my host house, every time I would get off, there was a street light that was out. So I would get off, it would be dark, and then I would have to walk essentially down an alley to get kind of to the corridor in which my street was on, and then walk down. And I remember the first few times having to do this alone. I had literally just gotten to London. I was all by myself, even though I was culturally not as different. There's still some sort of like culture shock. I was about 19, so I was not just away from home for the first time. I was like really away from home for the first time. And it was like, I would walk super fast and I would like book it back. Sometimes I would like feel like I was jogging and I would book it back. I always told people when I was leaving, when they should expect me home. But by the like 4th week of having to do this, I didn't even it didn't even register with me as a scary or potentially scary experience. I just kind of got off the train and walked home. And I remember telling this to someone once and they were like, you do what? Why would you do that? That doesn't seem safe. And that registering for me is really because I do it all the time. So for one of you, something may seem sort of arousing in that negative physiological sense, but for some of us, it's going to just register as like a stalemate. It's just going to be like, meh, every day for us. So I'm going to give you an example of cognitive valence theory. And I just want to preface this really fast that there may be some triggers that come with this story, because the story does involve an experience that I had with what I now know is stalking. At the time, I wasn't really aware that it was stalking. I felt a little uncomfortable by the behavior of this other individual, and there was certainly a very pivotal climax in the story that I'll get to here, where there was some behavior that was, now I reflect back on that and think, well, that was the very scariest, dangerous situation. But at the time, I didn't see it as that. So I just want to give you the trigger warning that if this is the point in which you're like, okay, those things have happened to me and I'm still really sorting them out and dealing with them, please feel free to stop here. I kind of cue back into the video at the end of the slide when I'll discuss that weird photo on my screen. So just to kind of give you a story on how this all plays in, and again, like I said with that trigger warning, right, that's my perception of the event. So my perception at the time was, meh. And your perception is, I'm just telling you the story is probably like alarm, 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 alarm. What is she saying? How did she not know? So perception playing a role in here. Okay, so when I don't even think my parents even know this story. When I first started in my undergraduate, I was taking a class, I think it was called the history of sports or something. And I am not a sports person. There's nothing about sports that I know, nothing about sports that I understand. I think I would refer to basket and basketball as a goal. I really know nothing about sports. And I like to play some things, but I don't really understand the rules of the things that I play. So when I was, probably I'm trying to even remember, was it my second semester, my freshman year, but it's irregardless. I was in this history of sports class. And I'm very struggling with the content and really struggling with the material. It was very historical, lots of dates, lots of elements, cultural shifts. And I had a big exam, our first sort of section exam coming up, and I was really struggling. And there was a student sitting next to me in this class, and I'll call him Mike, just because, not that I'm saying anything negative about Mike's, I'm just Mike. Sitting next to me, and I realized that Mike kind of always nodded his head, right? He took some detailed notes. Mike really seemed to, I don't know what was going on. So one day after class, I just kind of said, hey, do you know what's happening in this class? And Mike said, yeah, I'm a history major. I'm kind of taking this class as an easy elective. yeah, why, what's up, you know? And I'm like, oh, well, I have no idea what's happening. And we've got this big test coming up. And he was kind of like, okay, well, why don't we study together? I'm like, that's great, right? I've just found like a study buddy. I found someone who's going to help me not fail this class. And so he was like, okay, well, let's meet at the library and we'll study together. So we started meeting at the library, and it was one of those things where first you're kind of sitting farther apart, and then you meet a few times and you kind of sit closer together, and then you kind of develop this rapport where you're just like probably sharing notes with one another, and you're talking and you're asking a lot of questions and you're reviewing note cards together. And throughout the course of this, and it was all of like a matter of like 3 library meetings, because you can get the sense from me that I put everything out to everybody all the time, and I am a very jokey person and just really like extroverted. We started to develop a rapport where there was a lot of joking behavior. But I did not pick up on the joking behavior coming from him that was related to developing a physically intimate relationship. I had a boyfriend, a very serious boyfriend. I married him at the time, and I wasn't picking up on those subtle hints of, you know, that he liked me, that he was interested in me, that he wanted to do more with me. I did not even pick up on any of that because I was more interested in the task-related dimensions of our relationship. And so I was just totally like not even hearing him and mostly just focused on like, sounds really terrible, but how he can help me get an A in the class. And, you know, there was this time where we had like agreed we were going to meet at the library, and I sent him an IM because this is pre-text messaging and Facebook days. I sent him an IM saying like I couldn't meet in the library. I had to run back to my room. I had some other things I needed to do. When I got back to my room, cue scary music. When I got back to my room, the door to my quad was open. And so I lived in a quad, and I had 2 rooms on either side. And so the quad was like the common area, which I think some of you are familiar with. The quad to my door was open, and my first response to this was no arousal, right? Damn it, Jenna, you left the door open again, right? We've talked a little bit about how you're supposed to close the door. My roommate just leaves the door open and just wanders about all the time. Dang it, dang it, dang it, right? My stuff's going to get stolen or whatever. My immediate response to it was really just like, this happens all the time. The door gets left open, no big deal. And so I just kind of like walked into the room, and there, and even like now, you're probably feeling it. I'm feeling it, that like feeling that's happening right here where it's getting hard to breathe. There, kind of sitting in the corner of the room is Mike, and he's just kind of staring at me. And he's got, you know, like a book of mine in his hand from my bookshelf, and he's just kind of staring at me. And I was kind of like, what are you doing in here? And he's like, oh, well, I hope it's okay that I let myself in. So clearly the door had been shut, and he came into our quad without permission, and he had never been in my room before. I had never invited him to my room. It wasn't something that like roommates often do or floor mates often do. You kind of wander into each other's rooms after you get to know each other a little bit more. It was a female-only dorm, so how he got into the dorm is really interesting because you have to have a card to swipe to get in, and you have to be escorted around. And okay, so he's just kind of sitting there, and I was like, yeah, what are you doing here? And he's like, oh, well, you had IM'd that you couldn't meet in the library and that you were going back to your room. I thought that meant that, you know, it would be okay if we met here, or that you wanted me to meet you here. And I'm like, no, I didn't really want you to meet me here, but I guess you're here, so we'll study. So I just kind of sat on one end of the couch, and he kind of sat on the other, and I made sure to put some space between us, and we kind of studied, and the whole thing was kind of like awkward. And it was at that like point in time where I kind of started to get that like a little bit of arousal. Like that was really, really strange. That was really, really uncomfortable. What is kind of going on with this guy? So we had our exam, and I got a really good grade on the exam. And after I got my test back, I was just really, really excited that I ran up to him and like kind of gave him a huge hug and was just like, thank you. Thank you for helping me. You're the best. I love you. But I said it to him in a way that you might say to someone who's helped you get an A on an exam, right? Like, wow, oh my God, thank you. You saved my life. I love you. You're the best. Some of you don't throw around I love yous the way that I do. But I made the mistake of communicating to him verbally phrases that he clearly took to be not platonically friendly, but intimately friendly. And I didn't pick up on that. So what kind of ensues next is the biggest trigger part of this. So not even thinking about it, we didn't have an exam coming up for a little while longer. So I was like, okay, you know, I kind of kept my distance from him and just kept the conversation in class to be kind of class oriented only, and then just kind of like rushed out of class and went on my way. And I kind of proceeded through my life, and like a few weeks go by. And so one day I'm in my actual bedroom and I kind of hear the door creak and the door creak again. And I feel like somebody was in my quad, but whatever. So I open my room door and I kind of creep out and no one's there. And then like sitting on the coffee table is, you know, like you're totally Walmart white bear with red roses, you know, just totally like textbook weird stuff. And unless you've gotten a white teddy bear with roses from somebody that you actually care about and they care about you and that's a mutually reciprocal relationship, then I'm not knocking the white teddy bear and the red roses. I'm just saying that felt very serial killer film. I'm sitting on my coffee table and I had that moment of like, somebody was here, right? So I go up to the bear and I'm thinking it's probably for Jenna, it's probably for Alicia, it's probably for someone, and it's a card to me and it's from Mike. And I'm having that like, oh my, am I getting red? I might be getting red. Now I'm having that feeling where I'm like, oh shit, right? Yeah. Okay, time to solve this problem. And so I sent him an IM that just says, hey, we really need to talk. Can we talk later? And I'm overly polite. So I was like, thank you for the bear and the flowers. It was really lovely. Can we talk later? And he said, yeah, that would be great. You know, what time? And I was like, well, I'm not really sure. You know, I've got to run off to do this and this and this. But I'll let you know. Let's talk later. So the night goes on and I never sent him a text message back about all that. So I just kind of got back to my room and I, you know, got ready for bed and I climbed up. I was a top bunker. So I climbed up in my top bunk and I went to bed. And my roommate was there with her boyfriend and they always slept in the bottom bunk. And it was like no big deal. Boyfriend, we'll call him Rob, was always around. I mean, he pretty much lived there. Okay. And so I just climbed in my top bunk and I kind of covered myself up and I started to go to sleep. You know, right at the point where you're kind of like just dipping down into sleep. And I kind of felt the bunk bed shake a little bit and, you know, I kind of like half wake up and I like roll over and I look under the bunk because I'm like, not again, you know, like get it on somewhere else kind of thing. And I roll over and I realize they're asleep. And it's at that moment, and if your heart is beating pretty fast right now, so is mine. My blood pressure's probably through the roof. And it's at that moment that I look up and I see this like face peering up over at, your eyes are watering, my eyes are starting to water, peering up over the end of the bed at me. And I do one of those like quick, like kick, scream, shove everything to the bottom of the bed, curl yourself up, like moments. That's way beyond expectancy violation, right? That's way beyond that. And I'll never forget, what did I say? What name did I get from Rob? Jumping up out of bed, swinging around the corner, grabbing Mike off of the bed. I'm not even able to think right now. Off of the ladder and like slamming him up against the dresser. And the hilariousness is like Rob had, you know, red boxer shorts with white hearts all over them. You know, and my roommate Betsy at the time's, you know, nothing but her underwear, and like it's in the dark and everyone's screaming. I believe my Rob might have even had like a curling iron in his hand, and there's like a lot of screaming, and Rob's like gonna kick the junk out of this guy. He's got him slammed up against the dresser. He's like, "What are you doing in here? Who are you?" I'm screaming because I think I know what's happening here. And Mike's face is of just a complete like deer in the headlights, and he's like, she said we were going to talk later. You know, her and I we're dating. I don't understand what's going on here. It's not a big deal. And I'm like, we are not dating. I do not know you. You do not have permission to be here. And by this point now my RA's in the room. And then by this point now security's like in the room. And everybody's still like yelling and it's still dark and lights are getting flipped on and everybody's in their underwear. And public safety kind of pulls him out into the lobby and like sits him down. The poor guy's like sweating and he's just like having a flip out because he's just like, I don't understand. I wasn't doing anything wrong. And I'm like yelling at him. I'm like, how did you not understand? You can't just come into someone's room. I am flipped out. And all that happened. So I told you that really long story for a reason. Because if you stuck with me through the story despite my trigger warning, you probably experienced through my story a lot of arousal, a lot of high physiological arousal. And I tell that story every semester, and I try to tell it in the same way so that it creates those feelings, because I want you to feel what that feels like. That is physiological arousal. That is high arousal. That is uncertainty. That is fear. That is something that is an extra layer that goes way beyond someone just getting on an elevator and being like, I'm glad I have you all gathered here today. I'd like to discuss something important with you. And you being like, what are you doing, you crazy person? Or someone getting in line in front of you at Starbucks and violating your expectancy and being like, really, dude? You're really going to do that right now? This goes way beyond that, right? Cognitive valence adds on to all of that, this sense of how close you are to someone, not just in the reward value, but the behaviors that you've engaged in as an attempt to increase immediacy to that person, and the internal feelings that you have regarding uncertainty or regarding the environment, regarding your perception of the events, your personal feelings, all of that stuff kind of layered on here. And of course, cognitive schema. Like right now, I look back on that and I say schema is little bits of information that tell me what things are. So if I think about an event schema, I would say like event schema, if I see a front porch and it's got red Solo cups, loud music, and a big silver container that everybody's pumping liquid out of, that's a party, right? And I want to be there. That's those little itty bitty things along the way that tell me that that is a party. That's event schema. Cognitive schema is the same thing. It's these little itty bitty things along the way that signal for you some particular episode, some particular thing. And there was a lot of cognitive schema that led up to that that I did not perceive at the time. And now, every time I tell that story, I'm like thinking to myself, how did I not see those things? How did I miss those things? All those things were present. All those things were there. So in this sense, there was a lot of attempts to increase closeness. There's this high sense of like, insecurity and uncertainty. And that created a negative view. And obviously I like compensated, right? Compensated. So that's just a very elaborate example of sort of cognitive valence theory and one aspect of the reducing behaviors that we experience when we add these layers onto someone violating our expected behavior. And I'm going to kind of give you here another example that's a bit more positive. So I told you that I wanted to give you another example of cognitive valence theory. And this example that I want to give you is a bit more of that positive example when I'm talking a little bit about sort of moderate arousal versus no arousal. At one point in one of my small group classes, I was teaching a lecture and music started to play, and 2 or 3 individuals in my class stood up and started dancing. And as those 2 or 3 individuals got up and started dancing, 2 or 3 more individuals got up and started dancing, and then all of a sudden people from the hallway came into my classroom and all started dancing. And it became very clear from pretty much second number 5 of this whole scenario that there was a flash mob taking place in my class. So a flash mob taking place in your class violates your expectancy of behavior, because I don't think anybody ever expects their students to stand up and start a flash mob in their class. But it wasn't a negative thing. So it didn't create this like, uh-oh effect in my body. It created a positive effect where I was all of a sudden sort of happily in a state of physiological awareness. My level of perception was very positive. I was laughing. I started to dance along with them. So I did not respond by compensating. I responded by reciprocating. What ended up happening was during, though, this flash mob, this character in a purple, I don't even know, like sort of bear suit, essentially, came into the class and participated in the flash mob. When the flash mob was done, everybody kind of went back to sitting down. The students that were not in the class left and went back to whatever it is they were doing. And I tried my best to recover and continue to teach the lecture. Well, purple bear suit guy decided he was going to stick around for the lecture, and he just sat there during the entirety of the lecture. At first, it still created a sense of moderative arousal. Students were still looking at him and smiling and laughing, and it was really hard to get back to track and back to focusing on what it was we were doing. But after quite a few minutes of going by and me continuing on through the lecture, it became sort of a stalemate. It became kind of routine behavior. And there were a few things throughout the course of that semester that kind of happened that were really odd and really weird like that. And what was very interesting is as those things happened, students ended up having less responses to them, less concerns with how they were happening because it didn't register for them as anything positive or negative. It just kind of became one of these things where they were like, oh yeah, weird things like that happen in Sarah Potter's class. And so it didn't have a sense of arousal. It kind of created sort of stalemate behavior. So that's just another example that I wanted to give you between the differences of that sort of high negative feeling that you might get, the uh-oh feeling when something around you doesn't sort of match up with your expectations. Maybe something a bit more positive that happens to you where it doesn't match up with your expectations, but it isn't negative. And then, of course, the kind of everyday things that happen that really aren't an expectancy violation. I want to just kind of quickly point out here, if you noticed from the slide before to the slide now in my lectures as they have, as I've been doing this in like sections, that the page number down here has changed. This is kind of the difference between the old edition and the new edition. The new edition has these 6 factors for affecting and interpreting cognitive valence theory on page 70. These things include, cultural, relational, personal dynamics. So that's also something that I might take a look at that will add to your understanding of cognitive valence. So just to kind of wrap up our section here, the second section here on this chapter, we've covered a little bit about what is nonverbal communication and your understanding of the different definitions, spontaneous versus symbolic, the power and the systems of nonverbal, its universality, its importance in how we see it, the functions of different nonverbal, considering artifacts as nonverbal, and then, of course, expectancy violation versus cognitive valence theory. And I just left you here with some fun, more nonverbal photos that might help you kind of take the things that we've learned and apply it to the different scenario as you work to explain the different nonverbal behaviors happening in the photos. So that's kind of all that I want to say about nonverbal communication. There's a lot more that we could say, but a lot that we probably won't say for time's sake. So that's it.